The calculus professor called on the simple woman in the back row, hoping to humiliate her in front of everyone. "Miss Kirby, solve this equation now," he demanded with a smirk. Little did he know, Margaret Kirby had been solving complex mathematical formulas since she was 12. As she approached the board and picked up the chalk, the classroom fell silent. What happened next would change everything. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Rosewood University's mathematics building, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Margaret Kirby clutched her worn leather notebook as she navigated the busy hallways, feeling painfully out of place among students half her age. At 38, Margaret stood out in the sea of 20-somethings rushing between classes. Her simple navy blouse and gray cardigan contrasted sharply with the casual hoodies and trendy outfits surrounding her. She'd spent 20 years dreaming of this moment, returning to finish what she'd started before life took an unexpected turn. "Excuse me," she said softly, stepping aside as a group of laughing students hurried past. None of them noticed her, the invisible middle-aged woman trying to blend into a world that seemed to have no place for her. Room 307, Advanced Calculus with Professor Isaac Johnson. Margaret took a deep breath before entering. The lecture hall was intimidating, tiered seating facing a massive chalkboard already covered with complex equations that made her heart race with excitement rather than fear. She chose a seat in the back row, arranging her notebooks with methodical precision. "First day." The young woman beside her smiled kindly. "First day back," Margaret corrected with a small smile. "It's been a while." Before they could continue, the room fell silent as Professor Johnson entered. His reputation preceded him: brilliant, demanding, and notoriously difficult to impress. His silver-streaked hair and tailored charcoal suit projected authority, his piercing gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight seeking out weakness. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus." His voice filled the room without effort. "Look to your left. Look to your right. One of those people won't be here by midterms." A nervous chuckle rippled through the class. Margaret remained still, eyes forward, determined. "This isn't remedial math," Professor Johnson continued, writing an equation on the board with practiced strokes. "This is where we separate those who merely like mathematics from those who understand it." His eyes landed on Margaret, lingering just long enough to make her skin prickle with discomfort. She recognized that look, the one questioning her presence, wondering if she'd wandered into the wrong room by mistake. As Professor Johnson launched into his lecture, Margaret's hand moved across her notebook, transcribing his words but also adding notes in the margins. Corrections, alternative approaches, connections to theoretical concepts he hadn't mentioned. "Ms." Professor Johnson suddenly paused, looking directly at Margaret, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Kirby." "Margaret Kirby," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Ms. Kirby, you disagree with my approach." He'd noticed her writing independently of his lecture. "No, sir. Just taking notes." His lips tightened, eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. Well, Miss Kirby, perhaps you'd like to share your notes with the class tomorrow." The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. Margaret nodded once, knowing the challenge had just begun. By the end of the first week, Margaret had established a routine. She arrived early, reviewed her notes from the previous session, and prepared for Professor Johnson's increasingly pointed questions. "You worked in insurance, was it?" he asked one morning, glancing at her registration information. "Accounting," Margaret corrected quietly. "For a manufacturing company. Quite a leap to advanced theoretical mathematics." His tone suggested the leap was too great, an impossible chasm she could never hope to cross. The whispers had started too. Students wondering why she was there, what had brought her back to school at her age. Margaret ignored them, focusing instead on the elegant dance of numbers and theories she'd loved since childhood. In the faculty lounge, Dr. Deborah Burnside overheard conversations about the older woman in Johnson's class. "Isaac seems determined to drive her out," remarked Professor Buckley, stirring his coffee. Deborah frowned. "That's hardly fair. Has he even given her a chance? You know Isaac, Buckley shrugged. He's decided who belongs in his classroom before the semester even starts. Later that day, Deborah observed Margaret sitting alone in the mathematics library, surrounded by advanced texts well beyond the course requirements. Curious, she approached. Heavy reading for week 1, she commented, noting the titles on non-Euclidean geometry and complex analysis. Margaret looked up, slightly startled. Oh, just refreshing my memory. It's been a while. I'm Dr. Burnside. Differential equations. Deborah extended her hand. Margaret Kirby. They shook hands. You're in Isaac's class. How's that going? Margaret's polite smile revealed nothing. It's challenging. As it should be. Deborah studied her for a moment. You know, we have a faculty colloquium next week. Graduate students sometimes attend. You might find it interesting. Thank you, but I'm not sure Professor Johnson would. I'm inviting you, Deborah smiled. Tuesday, 4 p.m. Holmes Hall. Back in class, Professor Johnson seemed determined to find Margaret's breaking point. His questions to her grew more complex. His responses to her answers curt and dismissive. Ms. Kirby, perhaps you could explain to the class where you're struggling with this concept. It might help the others who are too shy to admit their confusion. Margaret looked up from her notes, meeting his gaze directly. I understand the concept, Professor Johnson. I was just considering an alternative approach to the proof. His eyebrows rose slightly. An alternative approach. How novel. The sarcasm dripped from every word. I'd be fascinated to hear it. Tomorrow, perhaps. The challenge hung in the air between them. Margaret nodded once, knowing this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the opportunity to publicly establish her inadequacy. I'll be prepared, she said quietly. Tuesday afternoon found Margaret in the back row of Holmes Hall, listening as faculty members presented their current research. Dr. Burnside had noticed her enter and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Most of the other attendees were graduate students, huddled together in small groups, occasionally glancing curiously at the unfamiliar face. Professor Johnson was the final presenter, discussing his work on applications of multidimensional calculus. Margaret listened intently, her notebook open, occasionally jotting down observations. She noticed a small inconsistency in his approach, nothing that invalidated his conclusions, but an inefficiency in his methodology that could be refined. As the presentations concluded and attendees mingled over coffee, Margaret debated leaving quietly. Dr. Burnside intercepted her. What did you think? She asked, gesturing toward where Professor Johnson was holding court with several admiring graduate students. It was fascinating, Margaret replied diplomatically. But Deborah's eyes were perceptive. Margaret hesitated. His approach to the integration sequence was traditional. You see another way. Before Margaret could respond, Professor Johnson himself approached, his expression cooling as he recognized Margaret. Ms. Kirby, this is unexpected. Undergraduate students rarely attend these sessions. I invited her, Dr. Burnside interjected smoothly. Margaret was just sharing some thoughts on your integration sequence. Professor Johnson's smile tightened. Was she indeed? And what revolutionary insights has Ms. Kirby gleaned from her extensive experience in accounting, wasn't it? The condescension hung heavily in the air. Several nearby conversations quieted as people turned to observe the exchange. I merely noted that the tertiary function could be simplified, Margaret said quietly. It would reduce the computational steps significantly. Professor Johnson's laugh was short and dismissive. If it could be simplified, don't you think someone would have done so in the decades this approach has been taught? Someone with perhaps more than a week of formal education in advanced calculus. Isaac. Deborah frowned. No, it's quite all right, he continued, eyes fixed challengingly on Margaret. In fact, this is perfect timing. Miss Kirby was going to dazzle us with her alternative approach tomorrow anyway. Perhaps she'd like to share her insights with our colleagues right now. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Graduate students exchanged glances, some embarrassed, others curious. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Part of her wanted to leave to escape the hostile scrutiny, but a stronger part, the part that had solved complex equations late at night after her daughter had gone to sleep, the part that had never stopped learning, even when life had forced her to pause her formal education, that part stood firm. "If you have a chalkboard available," she said evenly, "I'd be happy to demonstrate." Professor Johnson's smile was predatory. "By all means." The following day, tension hung in the air of room 307. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation at the faculty colloquium. Students whispered as they took their seats, glancing between Professor Johnson, who stood rigidly at the podium, and Margaret, who sat quietly reviewing her notes. "Before we begin today's lecture," Professor Johnson announced, his voice carrying an edge, "Ms. Kirby has volunteered to demonstrate her alternative approach to a standard integration sequence." The word "volunteered" drew a few knowing smirks from students who had heard what actually happened. "Ms. Kirby, the floor is yours." He gestured to the board with exaggerated courtesy. Margaret stood, gathering her notes. As she walked to the front, she felt every eye in the room following her progress. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady. This was familiar territory. The world of numbers and equations had always made sense to her, even when little else did. At the board she faced the class. Some students looked sympathetic, others skeptical, a few openly amused. In the doorway, partially hidden, Dr. Burnside stood watching silently. Professor Johnson sat at his desk, arms crossed. "Whenever you're ready, Ms. Kirby. Do enlighten us." Margaret turned to the board and began. Her handwriting was neat, methodical, as she laid out the standard approach first, explaining each step clearly. Then she paused, chalk poised. "The traditional method requires 12 distinct operations," she said, voice growing stronger. "But if we consider the relationship between these functions differently." She began working through her alternative approach. The chalk moved confidently across the board, defining a pathway that few in the room had considered. The initial skepticism in the room gradually shifted to attention, then to genuine interest. Professor Johnson's smug expression faltered as Margaret's solution progressed. He leaned forward, scrutinizing her work, searching for errors. Finding none, his frown deepened. "This can't be right," he interrupted. "You've skipped essential steps." "I haven't skipped them, Professor," Margaret replied calmly. "I've rendered them unnecessary by reframing the relationship between these variables." She continued writing, explaining as she went. From the doorway, Dr. Burnside smiled slightly, recognizing the elegant solution unfolding before them. A student in the front row whispered audibly to his neighbor, "Is she actually right?" "I think she is," came the astonished reply. Margaret completed her demonstration, circling her final result. 7 operations instead of 12, with identical results. She set down the chalk and turned to face Professor Johnson. "The traditional approach works perfectly well, of course. This is simply an alternative perspective." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Johnson stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. He approached the board, examining Margaret's work with laser focus. The class remained silent, collectively holding their breath. "This approach," he finally said, his voice tight, "while unconventional, appears to arrive at the correct solution." He turned to face Margaret. "Where did you encounter this method, Ms. Kirby?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I didn't encounter it. I developed it." A ripple of whispers swept through the classroom. Professor Johnson's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Developed it?" His tone remained skeptical. This sort of methodological innovation typically emerges from years of specialized research. "Yes," Margaret agreed quietly. "It does." From the doorway, Dr. Burnside stepped fully into the room. "Isaac, may I?" Without waiting for permission, she addressed the class. What Ms. Kirby has demonstrated is remarkably similar to the approach outlined in a paper published in the Journal of Mathematical Analysis last year. A paper that caused quite a stir in our field for its elegant simplification of traditional computational methods. Students straightened in their seats, eyes darting between the three adults at the front of the room. The paper, Dr. Burnside continued, was published under the pseudonym M.K. Howard. She looked directly at Margaret. A pseudonym that has appeared on 6 increasingly influential papers over the past decade, despite no one knowing the author's actual identity. Professor Johnson's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion, then to dawning realization as he looked at Margaret. "You're claiming to be M.K. Howard." Margaret nodded once, her composure never wavering. "I needed to publish anonymously. Without formal credentials, I knew my work wouldn't be taken seriously otherwise." A student in the back raised her hand tentatively. "Wait, M.K. Howard. My undergraduate thesis advisor had us all study those papers. He said they represented the future of computational theory." "I've read those papers too," another student added. "They're brilliant." Professor Johnson seemed momentarily at a loss for words, an unfamiliar state for the typically verbose professor. His eyes traveled from Margaret to the board, where her solution still stood, elegant in its simplicity. "Why are you here?" he finally asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "If you're truly M.K. Howard, you could be lecturing, not sitting in my classroom." "Because I want the credentials to match the knowledge," Margaret replied simply. "Because my daughter finally has her chance at college, and now it's my turn. Because I've spent 20 years learning in stolen moments, and I want to do it properly." The classroom remained silent as the implications settled. Dr. Burnside smiled slightly, watching as Professor Johnson confronted his own prejudices in real time. "Well," he said finally, adjusting his tie, "it seems we have much to discuss, Ms. Kirby." News traveled quickly through Rosewood University's mathematics department. By the following week, the story of Margaret Kirby, the unassuming returning student who was actually the mysterious M.K. Howard, had spread throughout the faculty and graduate student body. Professor Johnson's approach to Margaret underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift. The pointed questions designed to expose weaknesses were replaced by more thoughtful inquiries. His dismissive tone gave way to something resembling professional courtesy, though pride prevented a complete transformation. "Ms. Kirby," he said at the conclusion of Friday's lecture, "I've been reviewing your paper on nonlinear differential equations. There's a section on page 42 that I'd like to discuss if you have time." Students exchanged glances as Margaret nodded. The same professor who had tried to humiliate her was now seeking her input. After class, several students approached Margaret's desk. Ms. Kirby, a young woman with glasses, fidgeted nervously. "I'm having trouble with the concepts from last week. Some of us have a study group, and we were wondering if maybe you'd join us to explain things." Margaret smiled gently. "Of course. When do you meet?" In the faculty lounge, Dr. Burnside found Professor Johnson staring contemplatively out the window. "You're not the first to underestimate her, Isaac," she said, pouring herself coffee, "though you might be the first to admit it." He frowned slightly. "I haven't admitted anything. Your body language has. The way you address her now. The fact that you're reading her papers." Deborah smiled. "It's almost like you respect her. She's been working at an advanced level without formal training or guidance," he admitted reluctantly. "That's noteworthy." "It's exceptional," Deborah corrected. "And she did it while raising a child alone and working full-time." Professor Johnson's frown deepened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she's going to need a thesis advisor next year. Someone who can challenge her. Someone whose recommendation will carry weight." He raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting me, after I spent weeks trying to drive her out of my classroom?" "I'm suggesting you precisely because of that," Deborah replied. "You've seen your own prejudices now. And you're still the best in the department for the areas she's exploring." In the following days, Margaret found herself in an unexpected position. Students began approaching her for help, sitting near her in class, inviting her to join their discussions. Faculty members who had previously looked through her now stopped to introduce themselves. Professor Johnson observed these changes from a distance, watching as the woman he had dismissed as an out-of-place housewife playing at academics gradually became a central figure in his classroom's intellectual landscape. During one session, as Margaret patiently explained a complex theorem to a group of struggling students, he found himself thinking that perhaps he had something to learn from her after all. 3 weeks later, Professor Johnson stood before the department's curriculum committee, outlining his proposal for the spring semester. Seated among the faculty members was Margaret, invited as a special consultant due to her unique perspective as both student and published researcher. "The traditional sequence has served us well," Professor Johnson concluded. "But I believe we must consider evolving our approach." He glanced briefly at Margaret. "Recent methodological innovations suggest we may be doing our students a disservice by not incorporating more efficient computational frameworks." Dr. Howard Holmes, the department chair, leaned forward. "Correct me if I'm wrong, Isaac, but aren't you essentially proposing we adopt the M.K. Howard approach, the same approach you dismissed as amateur speculation last year?" A few uncomfortable chuckles circulated through the room. Professor Johnson cleared his throat. "I've reconsidered my position in light of new evidence," he said stiffly. "Academic integrity demands we follow the research, regardless of personal opinions, or personal biases," Dr. Burnside added quietly. The meeting concluded with tentative approval for Professor Johnson's proposed changes. As faculty members filtered out, he approached Margaret, who was gathering her notes. "Ms. Kirby, a moment." She looked up, her expression neutral. "Yes, Professor. The department is hosting a symposium next month on evolutionary approaches to calculus instruction. Given your unique perspective, your contribution would be valuable." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Are you asking me to present alongside faculty?" "I'm asking you to co-present with me," he clarified, the words clearly difficult for him. "Your practical applications complement my theoretical framework." The significance wasn't lost on either of them. This was more than a professional courtesy. It was a public acknowledgement of her expertise, a formal integration into the academic community that had initially rejected her. Later that afternoon, Margaret led her first official student help session. What had begun as an informal gathering had grown to include nearly half of Professor Johnson's class. "The trick isn't memorizing formulas," she explained to the attentive group. "It's understanding the relationships between functions." As she guided them through increasingly complex problems, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. This was what she had dreamed of during those late nights at her kitchen table, working through advanced mathematics by lamplight after her daughter had gone to bed. From the corridor, Professor Johnson observed the session briefly. The woman he had tried to humiliate was now teaching his students, explaining his material more effectively than he sometimes did himself. He turned away, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. Isaac Johnson was not a man who admitted mistakes easily, but he knew when he had been outmaneuvered, mathematically and otherwise. 6 months later, Margaret stood at the front of a packed lecture hall in the mathematics building. The departmental colloquium had drawn faculty and students from across the university, attracted by the first public appearance of the now revealed M.K. Howard. Professor Johnson sat in the front row, watching as she confidently navigated the presentation of her latest research. Her elegant explanations and intuitive approaches to complex problems kept even non-specialists engaged. "And so we find," she concluded, "that by conceptualizing these relationships, we open new pathways for both theoretical exploration and practical application." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. As questions began, Professor Johnson noted with satisfaction the respect in his colleagues' voices when they addressed her. No one questioned her right to be there anymore. Her brilliance had earned her place. When the formal session ended, Professor Johnson approached her at the podium. "Congratulations, Margaret," he said, using her first name for the first time. "That was masterfully presented." Thank you, Isaac, she replied with a small smile. He hesitated, then added, I owe you an apology. My initial assessment of you was. He paused, searching for the right word. Incorrect, she offered. Profoundly incorrect, he acknowledged. I allowed preconceptions to cloud my judgment. Margaret considered him for a moment. You know, in mathematics, we revise our hypotheses when new data contradicts them. It's not a failure, it's part of the process. A rather generous interpretation of my behavior, he noted dryly. I've had plenty of practice being underestimated, she replied. It taught me to recognize the value of people who can change their minds. As they walked together toward his office to discuss her upcoming thesis proposal, Professor Johnson reflected that his most important lesson this year hadn't come from a textbook or research paper, but from the quiet woman he had mistakenly tried to humiliate. If this story moved you, remember that brilliance comes in all forms and appearances. Have you ever been underestimated or witnessed someone else's hidden talents emerge? Share your experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more powerful stories that remind us never to judge by appearances. We'd love to hear where you're watching from.